If you told me on a quiet Tuesday morning that a box of chocolates would upend the sanctity of Nero Wolfe's brownstone on West 35th Street, I'd have laughed you out the door and bolted it behind you. But life, as I've learned after years of playing errand boy, secretary, and occasional punching bag for the great detective, has a way of tossing curveballs when you're least expecting them, and this curveball came wrapped in gold foil with a note that smelled faintly of bitter almond. Though I didn't notice that until later. It started around 11, just after Wolfe had settled into his custom-built chair behind the desk in the office, a fresh orchid perched in the vase like a silent bodyguard. I was at my own desk, typing up a report on a dull insurance fraud case we'd wrapped the previous week, when the doorbell chimed. Fritz, our chef and keeper of the household peace, was in the kitchen fussing over a lunch menu that probably included something unpronounceable. So I hauled myself up to answer it. On the stoop stood a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, if the magazine had been left in the rain for a week. Her navy coat was impeccably tailored, but her face was pale, her eyes darting like she expected somebody to jump out of the nearest hydrant. She clutched a small, elegant box gold, about the size of a cigar case under one arm, as if it held the crown jewels or a live grenade. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to make me curious. "I need to see Mr. Nero Wolfe. It's urgent." I gave her the standard once-over, early 30s, polished but rattled. No wedding ring, and a faint accent I couldn't place maybe. Boston with a twist of something European. "I'm Archie Goodwin, Mr. Wolfe's confidential assistant. He doesn't see callers without an appointment. Care to tell me what's so urgent?" Her lips tightened, and for a moment I thought she'd bolt. Then she squared her shoulders and said, "My name is Eleanor Vaughan. I believe someone is trying to poison me, and I think it started with this." She held up the gold box, her fingers shaking just enough to make the foil catch the light. "Poison. Now that's a word that gets my attention faster than a $20 tip." I stepped aside and gestured her in, leading her to the office. Wolfe, of course, didn't bother to look up from the book he was pretending to read. He's got a knack for making people feel like they're intruding on a papal audience, even when he's just skimming a cookbook for sauce recipes. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "this is Miss Eleanor Vaughan. She's got a story about poison and a shiny box. Thought you might want to hear it before lunch." He marked his place with a finger, sighed as if I'd asked him to climb Everest, and finally lifted his eyes to her. "Miss Vaughan," he said in that low, precise rumble of his, "I am indisposed to trivial interruptions. State your case briefly." She hesitated, then placed the gold box on the desk with a reverence that suggested it might explode if mishandled. "These chocolates were delivered to my home yesterday morning. No note, no sender, just my name on the label. I ate one last night and felt ill-dizzy, nauseous. I stopped after that, but I'm certain they're poisoned. I want to hire you to find out who sent them and why." Wolfe's expression didn't flicker. He leaned forward an inch, about as much physical exertion as he'll commit to on a good day, and studied the box without touching it. Poison is a serious accusation, Miss Vaughn. Have you consulted a physician or the police? I can't go to the police, she stammered. This is personal. There are people in my life who would suffer if this became public. As for a doctor, I saw one this morning. He said it could be food poisoning or something worse, but he couldn't be sure without testing. I didn't want to risk sending the chocolates to a lab. Not yet. I need discretion. I've heard you're the best. Flattery doesn't move Wolfe. But I caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He's a sucker for a challenge, even if he'd rather die than admit it. I leaned against my desk, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable dismissal. Instead, he said, Mr. Goodwin will take your details and a retainer. I make no promises, but I will consider your request. Leave the box. Do not touch its contents further. That was it. No fanfare, no questions. Just a curt nod that meant she was dismissed. Eleanor Vaughn looked like she'd expected a full interrogation, but she nodded, handed me a card with her address and phone number, and promised to send a check for $5,000 by courier. That afternoon, I escorted her out, locking the door behind her, and returned to find Wolfe staring at the gold box, like it was a chess opponent contemplating a bad opening move. Well, I said, dropping into my chair, poisoned chocolates. That's a new one, even for us. You buying it? He grunted a sound that could mean anything from mild curiosity to utter contempt. I dislike melodrama, Archie, but I also dislike unanswered questions. Arrange for the chocolates to be tested by a discreet laboratory. Speak to no one of this until we have results, and find out what you can about Miss Vaughn. Her reticence about the police is suggestive. I nodded, already mentally listing the calls I'd need to make. You think she's hiding something? Everyone hides something, he said, closing his book with a snap. The question is whether her secrets are worth my time or yours. And that, folks, is how a box of chocolates wormed its way into the brownstone, disrupting the sacred routine of beer at 6, dinner at 7, and orchids at 9. I didn't know it then, but we were about to bite into a case that would leave a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, including Wolfe's. If there's one thing Nero Wolfe guards more jealously than his orchids or his dinner schedule, it's the sanctity of the brownstone on West 35th Street. It's his fortress, his sanctuary, and on a good day my prison. So when outsiders start traipsing through the front door, leaving tension thicker than Fritz's béarnaise sauce, you can bet the air gets heavy. That's exactly what happened the day after Eleanor Vaughn dropped her gold box of trouble on Wolfe's desk. It started at 10 the next morning, after I'd already made a few discreet calls. I'd shipped one of the chocolates to a lab run by a chemist friend of Sol Panzer's, with strict instructions for silence and speed. I also dug up some preliminary dirt on Miss Vaughn. Nothing juicy yet. Just that she was a society type, recently widowed, with a townhouse on the Upper East Side and a reputation for hosting lavish dinner parties. I was itching to dig deeper, but Wolfe had other ideas. He was in his chair, nursing a glass of beer and glaring at a crossword puzzle as if it had personally insulted him. When the doorbell rang again, Fritz was elbow-deep in a pastry experiment. So I played doorman once more. This time, it wasn't just one nervous client on the stoop. It was a trio, and they looked like they'd been arguing since breakfast. First was Eleanor Vaughan herself, her navy coat swapped for a grey wool number. Her face still pale, but now set with determination instead of fear. Behind her stood a man, in his late 40s, lean as a greyhound, with slicked-back hair and a suit that screamed Wall Street. He had the kind of sharp, impatient eyes that size you up for a fight or a deal before you can blink. Trailing them was a younger woman, maybe 25, with a mousy demeanor and fidgety hands clutching a handbag like it was her lifeline. She avoided eye contact, staring at the stoop as if it held the secrets to the universe. "Miss Vaughan," I said, keeping my tone light but my guard up. Didn't expect a return visit so soon. And with company. "I'm sorry, Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't plan this. These are associates of mine. They insisted on coming when they heard I'd hired Mr. Wolfe. May we come in?" I didn't like the sound of insisted, and I liked the look of her associates even less. But Wolfe's rules are clear. Never turn away potential information at the door, even if it comes with baggage. I stepped aside, led them into the office, and watched Wolfe's expression sour faster than milk left in the sun. He didn't stand, of course, he didn't, but he set down his beer with a deliberate thud, and fixed the group with a stare that could freeze lava. "Miss Vaughan," he rumbled. "I was under the impression our arrangement was confidential. Explain this intrusion." Eleanor flushed, but before she could speak, the Wall Street type stepped forward, extending a hand that Wolfe ignored. "I'm Raymond Holt, Mr. Wolfe. I'm a business partner of Eleanor's late husband, and I handle certain financial matters for her now." When she mentioned poisoned chocolates, I felt obligated to ensure her safety and mine. If there's a threat, it may extend beyond her. Wolfe's eyes flicked to the mousy girl, who seemed to shrink under the attention. "And you?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. She mumbled, "Clara Dennis. I was Mrs. Vaughan's personal assistant. I just thought I could help. I packed the chocolates when they arrived. I saw the delivery. That got my attention." A witness to the drop-off could be gold, assuming she wasn't spinning a tale. I jotted a mental note while Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his silence louder than a shout. I've seen him pull this trick 100 times. Say nothing, let the room stew, and watch people squirm. It worked like a charm. Holt shifted his weight, impatience bleeding through his polished veneer. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. Clara stared at the floor, her fingers twitching on her handbag. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "I do not conduct investigations by committee, Miss Vaughan. If you wish to retain my services, you will adhere to my methods. Mr. Holt, Miss Dennis, your concerns are noted. Mr. Goodwin will record any relevant information you provide. Beyond that, I require solitude to think." It wasn't a request. It was a decree. Holt opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it under Wolfe's unrelenting gaze. Eleanor nodded, subdued. "Of course, Mr. Wolfe. I apologize. I'll send them out. No, Wolfe cut in, surprising me. They are here. Let them speak briefly. Archie, take notes. I pulled out a pad and pen, hiding a smirk. Wolfe was playing his game, keeping them close enough to observe, distant enough to control. I spent the next 20 minutes jotting down their stories, which were thin on facts and thick with undercurrents. Holt claimed he'd received anonymous threats weeks ago, unrelated to chocolates, but tied to business dealings. Clara stuttered. Through a vague account of the delivery of plain brown parcel. No return address. Handed off by a courier who vanished before she could ask questions. Eleanor added nothing new, just repeated her fear of public scandal with a glance at Holt that suggested there was more to that story than she'd let on. When they finished, Wolfe dismissed them with a wave, instructing Eleanor to remain available by phone as I ushered them out. I caught Holt muttering to Eleanor under his breath something about keeping this contained. Clara lagged behind, her eyes darting to the gold box still sitting on Wolfe's desk like a silent accusation. I didn't like the vibe any of them gave off, but I kept my trap shut until the door was locked and I was back in the office. Well, I said, dropping into my chair, that was a circus. You think they're all in on it, or just clueless? Wolfe grunted, retrieving his beer. I think, Archie, that the brownstone is no longer a place of peace. That displeases me. Find out more about Mr. Holt and Miss Dennis. Their presence is not accidental, and expedite the laboratory results. I wish to know if Miss Vaughan's fears are founded or if this is merely theatre. I nodded, already planning my next moves. The brownstone felt different now, like a guest, had overstayed their welcome and left a bad smell behind. Wolfe retreated into his silence, his eyes on the box, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just opened the door to something uglier than a bad batch of candy. What I didn't know yet was how personal it was about to get. There's a certain rhythm to working for Nero Wolfe that you either get or you don't. It's not all car chases and fistfights, though I've had my share of both. No, most of the time it's a slow dance watching, listening, piecing together the jagged edges of human nonsense until they form a picture even Wolfe can't ignore. After the brownstone got rattled by Eleanor Vaughan and her uneasy entourage, I knew the next step was mine. Wolfe doesn't leave his chair unless the world's ending. So it was up to me to start sniffing out the players in this little chocolate-coated drama. And let me tell you, by the end of the day, I had a cast of characters that could have filled a Broadway flop. I started with the basics. Wolfe had given me the green light to dig into Raymond Holt and Clara Dennis, and I figured I'd tack on a deeper look at Eleanor Vaughan while I was at it. But before I hit the streets, I got a call from Saul Panzer's chemist friend. The lab results on that single chocolate I'd sent over were in, and they weren't exactly comforting. Trace amounts of a toxic compound, something unpronounceable. That sounded like it belonged in a chemistry textbook, not a candy box. Not enough to kill outright, the guy said, but enough to make you wish you'd stuck to oatmeal. I relayed the news to Wolfe, who received it with his usual enthusiasm, that is, a grunt and a flicker of his eyelids. Interesting, he murmured, sipping his beer. Not lethal, but deliberate. A warning, perhaps, or a failed experiment. Proceed, Archie. Identify the players. Motive will follow. That was all the pep talk I was getting. So I grabbed my hat and coat and started with Eleanor Vaughan's circle. Over the next few hours, I pieced together a neat little web of suspects for maybe 5 folks who had the means, the motive, or just the right kind of shifty look to make my gut itch. I worked the phones first, calling in favors from a couple of newspaper pals and a guy at the DMV who owes me for keeping his name out of a messy divorce case Wolfe handled last year. Then I hit the pavement, tailing leads and asking questions the way only I can polite until politeness doesn't work. Then less polite. Here's what I turned up. First, there's Raymond Holt, the slick Wall Street type who'd barged into the brownstone with all the charm of a tax audit. Turns out Holt wasn't just a business partner of Eleanor's late husband, Victor Vaughan. He'd been neck-deep in a shady real estate deal with Victor before the guy keeled over from a heart attack 2 years back. Word on the street, or at least among the greasy diner stools where I got my info, was that Holt had been pressuring Eleanor to sell off some inherited properties at a loss. Properties he stood to profit from if flipped to the right buyers. If Eleanor got spooked or sick, maybe she'd sign quicker. Motive, greed, plain and simple. And those anonymous threats he'd mentioned could be real. Could be a smoke screen to make him look like a victim. I made a note to tail in later. Then there's Clara Dennis, the mousy assistant who looked like she'd jump at her own shadow. She'd been with Eleanor for 3 years, handling everything from scheduling tea parties to fetching dry cleaning. But a quick chat with a former maid at the Vaughan townhouse revealed Clara wasn't as meek as she played. Apparently, she'd been caught snooping through Eleanor's private papers more than once. And there'd been whispers of a falling out last month over a personal matter. The maid clammed up after that, but I got the picture. Clara had access hell. She'd handled the chocolate delivery herself, and maybe a grudge. Motive? Could be resentment, could be something uglier. I'd need to lean on her soon. Third up was a name I hadn't expected. Victor Vaughan's younger brother, Malcolm Vaughan. He wasn't at the brownstone yesterday, but my newspaper pal tipped me off that Malcolm had been spotted at Eleanor's place just a week before the chocolates arrived. Malcolm, unlike his late brother, had a reputation for living fast, gambling debts, bar fights, the works. He'd inherited nothing when Victor died, thanks to a will that left everything to Eleanor. And rumor had it he'd been hounding her for a cut ever since. Poisoning her with candy didn't seem like his style, too subtle for a guy who settles scores with fists, but a warning shot to scare her into paying up. That fit. Motive, money, with a side of family spite. Fourth was a wild card. A woman named Beatrice Lang. She was Eleanor's closest friend, or so the society pages claimed. But a quick chat with a caterer who'd worked one of Eleanor's dinner parties painted a different story. Beatrice and Eleanor had argued publicly a month ago, something about a loan or a broken promise. And Beatrice hadn't been back to the townhouse since. She was a widow herself, loaded but eccentric, with a knack for collecting rare poisons as artifacts for her private study. Yeah, you heard that right. If anyone knew how to slip a little nastiness into a chocolate, it'd be her. Motive, jealousy, maybe, or revenge for whatever slight she felt. I'd need to meet her in person to get a read. Lastly, I couldn't shake Eleanor Vaughn herself from the list. Sure, she was the client, the supposed victim. But I've been around long enough to know victims aren't always innocent. Why the secrecy about the police? Why the hesitation to name names until Holt and Clara forced her hand? My gut said she was hiding something, maybe a scandal. Maybe a regret that tied her to this mess tighter than she let on. Motive unknown. But self-preservation's a powerful driver. I'd keep her close, play nice, and watch for cracks dot by. The time I got back to the brownstone, it was pushing 5. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, fussing over his orchids with Theodore. So I typed up my notes and left them on his desk. When he came down at 6, beer tray in Fritz's hands, he skimmed the report without a word, his face as expressive as a brick wall. Well, I prompted, leaning back in my chair. 5 suspects, all with reasons to stir the pot. Where do you want me to start? He set the report down, took a sip of beer, and fixed me with that look, the one that says he's 5 steps ahead and I'm still tying my shoes. Satisfactory, Archie. Each has potential. But potential is not proof. Focus on Mr. Holt and Miss Dennis first. Their proximity to Miss Vaughn and to the delivery suggests involvement. And arrange a meeting with this Mrs. Lang. Her hobby intrigues me. I nodded, already itching to get back out there. The circle was drawn, the players named, but the game was just warming up. I had a feeling one of these fine folks knew more about that gold box than they were letting on, and I was going to find out, even if it meant stepping on a few polished toes. What I didn't expect was how soon the next curveball would hit. Right where it hurt most, the brownstone itself. There's a certain satisfaction in hitting the streets for Nero Wolfe. Even if I grumble about it half the time, it's not just the legwork, though my feet could tell you stories. It's the puzzle of it all. The slow tease of peeling back layers on people who think they've got their masks on tight. After sketching out our circle of suspects, Wolfe had laid out my marching orders, 0 in on Raymond Holt and Clara Dennis, and set up a chat with the poison-collecting Beatrice Lang. Easy enough, I thought, grabbing my hat and coat the next morning. Famous last words. By the end of the day, I turned over enough rocks to know this case wasn't just about a bad piece of candy. It was personal, messy, and probably uglier than I'd bargained for. I started with Raymond Holt, the Wall Street shark who'd strutted into the brownstone like he owned it. Tracking him down wasn't hard, a quick call to a broker. Pal got me his office address in the financial district, a sleek high-rise that screamed money and bad taste. I didn't bother with an appointment. Guys like Holt don't give straight answers over the phone, and I wanted to see his face when I started poking. I rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, flashed a fake business card claiming I was a private consultant, and got past his secretary by implying I had dirt on a rival firm. She bought it long enough to buzz me in. Holt was behind a mahogany desk the size of a small island, phone to his ear, barking orders about a merger. He didn't look thrilled to see me, but he waved me to a chair with the kind of forced courtesy that said he'd rather toss me out the window. I played it cool, crossing my legs and giving him a grin that's gotten me out of tighter spots than this. "Mr. Holt," I said, keeping my tone light, "I'm following up on Mrs. Vaughan's little chocolate problem. You seemed mighty concerned the other day. Care to elaborate on those anonymous threats you mentioned?" His jaw tightened, and he set the phone down slow, like he was buying time. "Goodwin, right? I told you what I know. A few letters, no specifics, just warnings to watch my back. Probably some disgruntled investor." I didn't connect it to Eleanor's situation until she mentioned poison. "That's all, sure," I said, nodding like I believed him. "But you've got a stake in her late husband's properties, don't you? Word is, you've been pushing her to sell. If she's out of the picture, say, too sick to sign papers, doesn't that gum up your plans? Or speed them up?" That got a reaction. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I thought he might lunge across the desk. Instead, he leaned back, forcing a laugh. "You've got a hell of an imagination, Goodwin. I'm helping Eleanor, not hurting her. She's in over her head with Victor's estate. If I wanted her out of the way, I wouldn't mess with Candy. Too sloppy." Maybe he had a point. Poison's not exactly the Wall Street way, but I filed his defensiveness away for Wolfe to chew on. I pushed a little more, asking about his whereabouts the day the chocolates were delivered. But he claimed he was in meetings with alibi witnesses I'd have to check. I left his office with a handshake that felt like gripping a wet fish and a hunch that Holt was hiding something, even if it wasn't murder. Next up was Clara Dennis, the jittery assistant who'd handled the candy delivery. She wasn't as easy to pin down. Eleanor said Clara had called in sick, but a neighbor near her cramped apartment in Murray Hill tipped me off that she'd been coming and going at odd hours. I staked out the place for an hour, nursing the coffee from a corner deli, until I spotted her slipping out in a scarf and coat that screamed, "Don't notice me." I tailed her to a small diner 3 blocks over, where she slid into a booth and started fidgeting with a sugar packet like it was her last lifeline. I slid in across from her, ignoring her startled gasp. "Miss Dennis," I said, flashing a smile. "Archie Goodwin. We met at Mr. Wolfe's. Let's chat about that chocolate delivery. You saw the courier, right? Anything stand out?" Her hands froze, and her eyes darted to the door like she might bolt. I told you everything. It was just a regular delivery. Brown package, no name. The guy was in a hurry, wore a cap. I didn't think anything of it until Mrs. Vaughan got sick. "UH, huh?" I said, leaning forward. "But you've got keys to her place, access to her mail. Ever notice anything odd before this? Arguments? Visitors? Maybe a grudged-up friend who'd pull a stunt like this?" Clara's face went paler. If that was possible, and she mumbled something about not wanting trouble, I pressed gently to hard and she'd clam up for good and got her to admit she'd overheard Eleanor and Beatrice Lang arguing weeks back. Something about trust and debts. Interesting, considering Beatrice was already on my radar. Clara swore she didn't touch the chocolates beyond unpacking them, but her shaky voice told me she knew more than she was spilling. I let her go with a warning to stay reachable, figuring I'd circle back later. Last on my list for the day was arranging a meet with Beatrice Lang, the poison hobbyist. I called her from a payphone, didn't want her tracing me to the brownstone yet, and played the curious journalist angle, saying I was writing a piece on obscure collectibles. She bit, her voice smooth and intrigued, over the line, and agreed to meet the next afternoon at a tea room on Madison Avenue. I'd save the hard questions for face-to-face, but her eagerness to talk about her artifacts gave me a chill I couldn't shake. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was past 6. Wolfe was in his chair, a fresh beer in hand, waiting for my report like a king expecting tribute. I typed it up quick, handed it over, and watched him skim it with that unreadable look of his. "Satisfactory, Archie," he said finally, setting the pages down. "Mr. Holt's evasiveness is predictable, but noteworthy. Miss Dennis's reticence suggests fear, perhaps of exposure, perhaps of retribution. And Mrs. Lang, her involvement, if confirmed, could be pivotal. Proceed with the meeting tomorrow. Observe closely." I nodded, collapsing into my chair with a sigh. My feet ached, my notebook was full, and my head was buzzing with half-formed theories. Holt's greed, Clara's nerves, Beatrice's creepy pastime, many of them could have spiked that chocolate, or known who did. But I had a feeling the real kicker was still under wraps, waiting to jump out when I least expected it. And knowing our luck, it had probably hit closer to home than the streets I'd just worn out. There's a certain order to life in Nero Wolfe's brownstone on West 35th Street. A rhythm as predictable as sunrise, assuming the sun rises, with beer at 6, dinner at 7, and a scowl at anything that disrupts the schedule. So when something slips out of place, even something small, it's not just an annoyance, it's a declaration of war. After a day of pounding the pavement, chasing down Raymond Holt's alibis and Clara Dennis's half-truths, I came back expecting the usual sanctuary of routine. Instead, I walked into a quiet storm, one that had Wolfe simmering in his chair and Fritz fretting in the kitchen, all over a jar of spice that wasn't where it should have been. It was just past 6 when I got in, my notebook fat with scribbles from my legwork and my head buzzing with theories about poison-happy Beatrice Lang, whom I'd be meeting the next day. I hung my hat and coat, ready to type up my report, when Fritz intercepted me in the hall with a look that said trouble faster than a neon sign. He's not one for dramatic Swiss stoicism, runs deep, so when he's rattled, I pay attention. "Archie," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "there is a problem in the kitchen. You must tell Monsieur Wolfe. I do not like to disturb him before beer, but this, it is wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "Wrong how? Did the sofa flop?" He didn't smile. "No, my saffron jar. It is not in its place. I keep it on the second shelf. Left side, always. This morning it was there. Now it is on the counter, near the sink. I did not move it. No one should touch it. Now, a misplaced spice jar might sound like small potatoes, especially compared to poisoned chocolates. But in this house, It's a felony. Fritz's kitchen is sacred ground, a temple of culinary precision. And nobody least of all me messes with his system. Wolfram, our resident detective, might not cook, but he's got a nose for anything that smells off, figuratively and literally. I told Fritz to hang tight and marched into the office, where Wolfe was already settled with his beer tray, looking like a mountain about to erupt over a misplaced pebble. "Trouble in paradise," I said, keeping my tone light but serious. "Fritz says someone's been playing musical chairs with his saffron jar. It's not where he left it. He's sure he didn't move it. And I know I didn't." Thoughts? Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and he set his glass down with a deliberation that told me he was taking this as seriously as a murder rap. He doesn't abide intrusions not in his routine, not in his space, and sure as hell not in Fritz's domain. "When was it last seen in its proper place?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "This morning, per Fritz. He noticed it gone just now, getting ready for dinner prep. Nobody's been in today, no clients, no deliveries, just us." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the wall. "Curious," he murmured, "an inconsequential item, yet deliberately moved. Not theft saffron, while valuable, is hardly worth the risk. A message, perhaps, or a test. Archie, inspect the kitchen. Look for other discrepancies, however minor, and question Fritz further. Discretion, please. I do not wish him agitated before dinner." I nodded and headed back to the kitchen, where Fritz was hovering near the stove, pretending to stir a pot of something fragrant while casting nervous glances at the counter. I gave the place a once-over every shelf, drawer, and nook I could think of, checking for anything else out of whack. Nothing jumped out. The knives were lined up like soldiers. The pantry was untouched. Even the damn tea towels were folded just so. But I noticed one thing, a faint scuff on the floor near the back door, like someone had dragged a shoe in a hurry. Could have been nothing, could have been something. I filed it away. "Fritz," I said, keeping my voice casual, "you sure nobody popped in today? Delivery guy, maybe? Someone fixing the pipes?" He shook his head, adamant. "No, Archie. I was here all day, except for a quick trip to the market at 10. I locked the doors, as always. Monsieur Wolfe was in the plant rooms with Theodore, then in the office. No visitors. That left a narrow window. Assuming someone slipped in while Fritz was out and Wolfe was upstairs with his beloved orchids. Breaking into the brownstone isn't child's play. We've got locks. That'd make a bank vault jealous, but it's not impossible for someone with nerve and know-how. I reported back to Wolfe, mentioning the scuff and the timeline. He listened without interrupting, which is never a good sign. It means he's thinking. And when Wolfe thinks, someone usually ends up regretting it. Unsettling, he said at last, taking a slow sip of beer, a subtle trespass, but intentional. It connects, Archie. Though the thread is not yet clear, someone wishes to unsettle us or to observe our reaction. Continue your inquiries tomorrow with Mrs. Lang, and revisit Miss Dennis. Her access to Mrs. Vaughan's household may extend to ours indirectly. Meanwhile, I shall consider this rearrangement I didn't like the sound of that. The brownstone is our fortress, and any crack in the wall feels personal. I typed up my report from the day's legwork, adding the saffron incident at the end, and left it on Wolfe's desk. Dinner was tense. Fritz served a braised lamb shank that should have been heaven. But even Wolfe ate with less gusto than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. I kept my mouth shut, knowing better than to prod when he's brooding. As I cleared my plate, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. A jar moved just so. In a house nobody should have entered. It wasn't just a prank. It felt like a gauntlet tossed down. A quiet dare to Wolfe to figure out who'd breached his sanctum. And I had a hunch it tied back to that gold box of chocolates, to Eleanor Vaughan's nervous eyes, or maybe to one of the shifty characters I'd been chasing. Holt, with his slick excuses, Clara, with her trembling hands, or Beatrice Lang, who I hadn't even met yet, but whose poison collection already gave me the creeps. I went to bed that night with more questions than answers. The scuff mark by the back door burned into my brain. Wolfe stayed in the office late, probably turning the problem over like a chessboard. In his head, I knew he'd take this seriously, hell. More seriously than the chocolates themselves, because if there's one thing he won't tolerate, it's a violation of his turf. Whoever moved that jar had poked a bear, and they didn't even know it yet. But they would. Soon. There's a point in every case with Nero Wolfe where the air gets thicker, like you've stepped into a room just before the storm breaks. It's not always a gunshot or a body dropping. Sometimes it's quieter, sneakier, but no less dangerous. After the subtle trespass of Fritz's saffron jar being moved, the brownstone felt like a coiled spring, and I knew Wolfe was itching to figure out who'd had the gall to invade his domain. I was too, but I had my marching orders. Meet Beatrice Lang, the poison enthusiast, and keep pressing Clara Dennis for cracks in her story. What I didn't expect was the next twist to come so fast, or for it to tighten the noose around us in a way that made even Wolfe sit up straighter in his chair. I started the day with a quick breakfast. Fritz's omelette, still perfection despite his rattled nerves over the kitchen intrusion, and headed out to meet Beatrice Lang at the tea room on Madison Avenue. The place was all lace curtains and overpriced finger sandwiches. The kind of spot where you're expected to whisper and sip like you're auditioning for royalty. Beatrice was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a porcelain cup in her manicured hands. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and poised, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore a tailored green dress and a brooch that looked like it cost more than my car. And I got the distinct impression she was sizing me up before I'd even said a word. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "A pleasure. I understand you're curious about my little collection. Poisons are such misunderstood artifacts, don't you think?" I played along with the journalist angle, settling across from her with a notebook I pretended to scribble in. "Sure, Mrs. Lang. Most people don't keep hemlock vials as conversation starters. How'd you get into it?" She laughed, a low, practiced sound, and launched into a spiel about historical toxins curare from South America. Arsenic from Victorian murder scandals, like she was giving a museum tour. I let her talk, watching for tells. Her hands stayed steady, her gaze direct. But there was a flicker of something when I casually mentioned modern applications of poison. I pivoted, keeping my tone light. Ever come across something like, say, a slow-acting compound? Something you'd slip into food or candy? Maybe. For a quiet warning, her smile didn't waver, but her fingers tightened on the cup for a split. Second, an interesting hypothetical. Mr. Goodwin, I deal in antiques, not recipes. Though I suppose anything's possible with the right knowledge. Why do you ask? Just curious. I lied, grinning. Heard a wild story about tainted chocolates recently. Got me thinking. She sipped her tea, unruffled. How dramatic. I hope no one was hurt. Poisons are far more elegant in theory than in practice. That was all I got. Smooth deflections and no hard leads, but I left the tea room with her. Got feeling she knew more about practice than she let on. I'd report it to Wolfe. Let him chew on her non-answers. Beatrice Lang wasn't just a collector. She was a player, and I'd bet my last dime she had motive tucked up her sleeve. I was halfway back to the brownstone, mulling over how to approach Clara Dennis again, when my phone buzzed. It was Saul Panzer, our go-to operative when Wolfe needs an extra set of eyes or a quiet hand. Saul doesn't call unless there's something worth hearing, so I pulled over to a curb and answered. Archie, he said, his voice calm but clipped. Got a tip for you on the Vaughn case. I've been poking around Eleanor's townhouse like. Wolfe asked last night. Caught sight of someone watching the place guy in a grey overcoat, loitering across the street for over an hour this morning. Didn't look like a cop or a reporter, more like hired muscle or a nervous tail. I snapped a photo. Lousy quality, but I'll send it over. Thought you'd want to know. Damn right I do, I said, my mind racing. Stick around if you can, Saul. See if he comes back. I'll run it by Wolfe. I hung up, the hairs on my neck prickling. Surveillance on Eleanor's place wasn't random, it tied into the chocolates. Maybe even the saffron jar incident. Someone was keeping tabs. And I didn't like the idea of eyes on our client. Or indirectly on us. When I got back to the brownstone around 3, I relayed Saul's report to Wolfe. Cool was in his chair with a book on orchids he wasn't really reading. I showed him the grainy photo. Saul texted a blurry shot of a stocky guy in a grey coat, face half hidden by a brimmed hat. Wolfe studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Troubling, he said finally, setting the photo on his desk. Surveillance suggests intent, either protection or intimidation. It escalates the matter beyond a mere personal grievance. Archie, instruct Saul to maintain observation, discreetly, and revisit Miss Dennis today. Her proximity to Mrs. Vaughn makes her a likely point of leakage, intentional or otherwise. I nodded, already mentally mapping my next move. Clara's apartment wasn't far, and I caught her just as she was stepping out. Bundled in that same nervous scarf, she froze when she saw me, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. Mr. Goodwin, I don't have time, she stammered. I told you everything. Not quite, I said, blocking her path with a friendly but firm stance. "Someone's watching Mrs. Vaughan's place. You know anything about that? Strange faces, odd calls. Maybe a guy in a grey coat." Her face went white, and she clutched her bag tighter. "No, I swear, I haven't seen anyone. I've been staying away since the chocolates. Mrs. Vaughan told me to keep my distance. For now." That was news. Eleanor hadn't mentioned benching Clara, and it raised a flag. "Why the distance? She's scared of you, or for you." Clara hesitated, then mumbled. She didn't say. "Just safety. Please, I have to go." She pushed past me, and I let her, knowing I'd get more out of her later if I didn't push too hard now. But her reaction confirmed Wolfe's hunch she was a weak link, scared or complicit. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took in my update with a grunt, his fingers steepled. "Pressure mounts, Archie. A watcher at Mrs. Vaughan's residence. A trespass. In our own these are not coincidental. The instigator seeks to unsettle, to control through fear or disruption. We must accelerate, continue with Saul's assistance, and tomorrow bring Mrs. Vaughan in again. I wish to observe her response to these developments." I agreed, feeling the case shift under my feet. The brownstone no longer felt like just a backdrop, it was a target, same as Eleanor's townhouse. Dinner that night was quiet, Fritz still on edge, Wolfe brooding over his veal cutlet. I couldn't shake the image of that grey-coated figure, or the moved saffron jar, or Beatrice's cool deflection. The storm was closer now, and I had a bad feeling we were about to get soaked. Working for Nero Wolfe is like playing chess with a grandmaster who refuses to leave his square. He doesn't move much physically, but every word, every glance, every damn pause is a calculated play. After the pressure ratcheted up with Saul Panzer's report of a watcher at Eleanor Vaughan's townhouse, and the unsettling trespass with Fritz's saffron jar, I could see Wolfe shifting gears. Not that he'd admit it. No, he sat in his oversized chair in the brownstone office, sipping beer at precisely 6 o'clock, looking for all the world like he was contemplating nothing more than tomorrow's orchid schedule. But I've been around long enough to know when he's building a trap. And right now, with this case creeping closer to home, he was positioning his pieces with a precision that told me someone was about to get checkmated. Started the morning after Saul's call, around 9, when I got Eleanor Vaughan on the line as per Wolfe's instructions. She sounded edgier than before, her voice tight as a piano wire, and agreed to come to the brownstone by noon. I relayed that to Wolfe, who merely nodded and returned to his book, a heavy tome on medieval poisons, which I figured wasn't coincidental reading. He didn't share his plan, of course. Wolfe doesn't explain, he orchestrates. My job was to execute, observe, and keep my mouth shut unless asked. Fine by me. I had enough on my plate with Saul's surveillance updates and a lingering itch to pin down Clara Dennis's shaky story before Eleanor arrived. Wolfe gave me a rare glimpse into his strategy. "Archie," he said, setting the book down with a deliberate thud, "today is not for confrontation, but for observation. Mrs. Vaughan's demeanor under stress will reveal more than her words. Note her reactions, particularly to the surveillance report, and summon Mr. Holt as well. Not immediately. Time it for an hour after her arrival. I wish to see them separately, then together if necessary. Their interplay may illuminate. I raised an eyebrow. You think Holt's tied to the Watcher, or just rattling her cage for leverage on those properties? Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to disdain. I think, Archie, that motives overlap in this affair like a poorly woven tapestry. Unravel one thread, the others follow, proceed. So I did. I called Raymond Holt, catching him at his Wall Street lair. He wasn't thrilled about the summons, grumbled about meetings and deadlines, but I dropped a vague hint about new developments regarding Mrs. Vaughan's safety, and he bit, agreeing to show up at one. I kept Clara Dennis and Beatrice Lang on the back burner for now, per Wolfe's focus. Though I knew their turns were coming, Saul, meanwhile, texted that the grey-coated Watcher hadn't reappeared at Eleanor's townhouse, but he'd spotted a different Gaitor, weary, lingering near her street late last night. More eyes, more pressure. I passed that to Wolfe, whose only response was a slight tightening of his lips before he retreated to the plant rooms. With Theodore for his morning orchid ritual, Eleanor arrived at noon sharp, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. Her coat was impeccable, her hair pinned just so, but her eyes darted like a hunted deer's, and her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse as I led her into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, never does, but he fixed her with that steady gaze that makes most people squirm. She sat in the red leather chair, spine stiff, waiting for him to speak. Mrs. Vaughan, Wolfe began, his tone deceptively mild. You are aware of the severity of your situation. Poisoned confectionery is no trivial matter. But there is more. My associate, operating discreetly, has observed surveillance near your residence. Individuals watching, undocumented, unknown. What do you know of this? Her breath caught, and I saw her fingers tighten on the purse until her knuckles whitened. Surveillance. I had no idea. I've been careful, staying inside mostly since the chocolates. Are you sure it's not reporters or neighbors? Wolfe leaned back, his bulk unmoving, but his presence suffocating. I am sure of nothing, madam, save that eyes are upon you. If not reporters, then who? Business associates? Personal enemies? Speak. She hesitated, licking her lips, then shook her head. I don't know. Truly, after Victor died, there were complications. Creditors, old partners like Raymond Holt. Some weren't happy with how the estate was settled. But watching me, that's paranoia, isn't it? I jotted a note. Her denial felt rehearsed. And that pause before mentioning Holt was a red flag. Wolfe didn't press, just let the silence stretch until she shifted uncomfortably. He changed tack. And within your household, Miss Dennis, your assistant, her behavior since this incident. Has it altered? Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. Clara, she's been nervous, distant. I told her to stay away for now, for safety. She handled the delivery, after all. I didn't want. She trailed off, and I saw genuine fear flicker across her face. Wolfe saw it too, though his expression didn't budge. Understood. he said, waving a hand as if dismissing a triviality. Remain available, Mrs. Vaughn. We are far from resolution. Archie, escort her to the front room. She may wait briefly if she chooses. I did as told, leaving her to cool her heels with a magazine while I returned to Wolfe. She's hiding something, I said, dropping into my chair. That bit about Holt, there's bad blood there. And she's spooked about Clara. You buying? The no idea on the surveillance. Wolfe grunted, partially. Fear is real, ignorance is not. She suspects, but will not name. We shall see if Mr. Holt loosens her tongue or his own. Holt rolled in at 1:15, all polished impatience. His slick suit and sharp eyes cutting through the brownstone's calm like a knife. I brought him straight to the office, where Wolfe was sipping a fresh beer, looking about as welcoming as a bear trap. Holt didn't sit until invited, which took longer than he liked, and when he did, he crossed his legs with a casual arrogance that made me itch to wipe the smirk off his face. Mr. Holt, Wolfe rumbled, your concern for Mrs. Vaughn's safety was noted in your prior visit. Yet I find it curious. Surveillance has been detected at her residence. Are you aware of such activity? Or perhaps responsible for it? Holt's smirk faltered, just for a split second, before he recovered with a scoff. Surveillance. News. To me. I've got no reason to tail Eleanor. I'm trying to help her manage Victor's mess, not scare her. If someone's watching, it's probably some low-life creditor. I've had my own threats. As I told you, Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and I knew he was cataloguing every word, every tick. Indeed, threats. Yet you omit specifics. I dislike vagueness, sir. If you wish my assistance saw Mrs. Vaughn's protection, clarity is required. Holt shrugged, unfazed. I've got nothing to hide. Check my story. I've been in meetings, visible, accounted for. Ask Eleanor yourself if you think I'm the problem. Oh, I shall, Wolfe said, his tone a velvet blade. She waits in the next room. Archie, invite her in briefly. I fetched Eleanor, and the tension in the office spiked as the two faced off under Wolfe's gaze. They didn't speak much. Wolfe asked pointed questions about their business dealings. Watching for discord, I saw it, Eleanor's tight lips. When Holt mentioned mutual interests, Holt's quick glance at her when debts came up. Wolfe dismissed them both after 10 minutes, with instructions to remain reachable. As I showed them out, I caught Holt murmur to Eleanor, keep this tight, no slips. She nodded, pale. Back in the office, Wolfe was silent for a long stretch before speaking. Progress. Archie, their unease is palpable. Mr. Holt manipulates. Mrs. Vaughn resists. The surveillance is a lever one I shall use. Prepare to summon all parties soon. The tension must peak, and I intend to direct it. I nodded, recognizing the setup. Wolfe was tightening his grip, baiting reactions, steering the game from his chair. The brownstone was still a fortress, but now it was also a stage, and Wolfe was setting the scene for the final act. I just hoped the curtain wouldn't drop on us first. There comes a moment in every case with Nero Wolfe when the threads start to knot together, not because the mystery is solved, but because Wolfe decides it's time to yank them tight, He doesn't chase, he waits, orchestrates, and then summons everyone into the brownstone office for what I call the Grand Inquisition. It's never loud or messy. Wolfe doesn't do drama, but it's a pressure cooker all the same. With him sitting like a judge behind his desk, peeling away lies with nothing more than words, and that stare of his, after days of surveillance, reports, a trespassed saffron jar, and uneasy dance steps with Eleanor Vaughan and Raymond Holt. Wolfe deemed the moment ripe. He was ready to gather the players, and I was ready to watch the sparks fly, subtle as they'd be. It was a Thursday morning when Wolfe laid out the plan over breakfast. Fritz's poached eggs and brioche, which I savoured knowing the day would be long. Archie, he said, dabbing his lips with a napkin, arrange for all relevant parties to convene here at this afternoon. Mrs. Vaughan, Mr. Holt, Miss Dennis, and Mrs. Lang. Inform them it is not optional. I wish to discuss developments in the matter of the poisoned chocolates and related intrusions. Saul Panzer will attend as well, discreetly positioned. I anticipate resistance. I nodded. Sipping my coffee, you think one of them will crack under the spotlight? Or are we just fishing for twitches? Wolfe grunted, which is as close as he gets to a shrug. I think, Archie, that proximity breeds revelation. Collective presence often exposes individual deceit. Make the calls. Ensure punctuality. I spent the next hour on the phone, dialing up our cast of suspects with the tone of a guy who doesn't take no for an answer. Eleanor Vaughan agreed quickly, her voice trembling, but resigned. Raymond Holt griped about his schedule, but caved when I mentioned critical updates on surveillance. Clara Dennis sounded like she'd rather jump off a bridge than show up, but a firm reminder of her role in the chocolate delivery got her to mutter a yes. Beatrice Lang was the coolest of the bunch, her silky voice almost amused as she confirmed, like she was accepting an invitation to afternoon tea instead of a grilling. Saul, ever reliable, just said he'd be there, no questions asked, by noon. The stage was set, and I felt that familiar buzz, the kind that comes when Wolfe's about to turn a room into a chessboard dotted to sharp. They started arriving. I played doorman, ushering them into the office one by one, seating them in a semicircle of chairs facing Wolfe's desk. Eleanor took the red leather chair, her purse clutched like a shield, her face pale but composed. Holt settled next to her, legs crossed, exuding that Wall Street arrogance even as his eyes flicked warily to Wolfe. Clara perched on the edge of her seat, hands fidgeting, looking like she might bolt any second. Beatrice Lang sat last, her posture perfect, a faint smile playing on her lips, as if she found the whole thing mildly entertaining. Saul slipped in quietly through the side door from the front room, leaning against the wall near my desk with a nod to me, unobtrusive, but ready if needed. Fritz had been instructed to stay in the kitchen. Wolfe didn't want distractions. Wolfe surveyed them from behind his desk, his bulk immovable, a fresh orchid in the vase beside him like a silent witness. He didn't speak for a full minute, letting the silence build, and I saw Clara twitch. While Holt shifted impatiently, I stayed at my desk, pen and pad ready, not for notes, really, but to look busy while I watched their faces. Finally, Wolfe spoke, his voice a low rumble that filled the room without effort. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you are here because a crime has been committed, poison administered through confectionery, delivered to Mrs. Vaughan. This is compounded by subsequent intrusion surveillance at her residence, and a violation of this very household. I have no patience for evasion. We shall address the matter methodically. I will speak. You will respond when addressed. Clarity is demanded." Eleanor swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on her purse. Holt's smirk faded. Though he kept his chin up, Clara stared at the floor, trembling. Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but her eyes locked on Wolfe with a sharpness that told me she wasn't underestimating him. He started with Eleanor, gesturing slightly with one hand. "Mrs. Vaughan, you engaged my services out of fear for your life. Yet you withhold surveillance near your home to individuals at separate times. You claimed ignorance. Reconsider. Who might watch you, and why?" Her lips parted, then closed. After a beat, she stammered, I truly don't know. Perhaps someone tied to Victor's business dealings. There were disputes after his death, debts, claims. I've tried to stay out of it. Raymond might know more." Her glance at Holt was quick, almost accusatory. Wolfe's gaze shifted to Holt, who straightened under the weight of it. "Mr. Holt, your name emerges often in connection with business. You, too, report vague threats. Yet specificity eludes you. Surveillance on Mrs. Vaughan, your orchestration, or another's." Holt's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. "I've said it before, Wolfe. I'm not tailing her. If someone is, it's likely a creditor or competitor. Victor owed money to rough types. I've been cleaning up his mess for Eleanor's sake, not causing it. A lie, or half of one. I could smell it, and I bet Wolfe did too. He didn't challenge it directly, turning instead to Clara. Miss Dennis, you handled the delivery of the chocolates. You've displayed reticence, fear, surveillance, poison, intrusion. What do you conceal? Speak." Clara's head jerked up, her eyes wide. I don't know anything about surveillance. I swear. I just unpacked the box. That's all. I've been scared since Mrs. Vaughan got sick. I thought maybe it was my fault somehow, but I didn't do anything." Her voice cracked, and I saw Beatrice's faint smile twitch, though she stayed silent. Wolfe pressed Clara a moment longer, asking about odd visitors or calls at Eleanor's home. But she shook her head frantically, insisting she'd seen nothing. Finally, he turned to Beatrice, his tone unchanged, but his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Mrs. Lang, your peculiar interest in toxins is noteworthy. A slow-acting poison in chocolate aligns with expertise. Your acquaintance with Mrs. Vaughan has strange disputes, I'm told. What role do you play in this?" Beatrice tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "None, Mr. Wolfe, beyond friendship. My collection is academic, historical. I've had disagreements with Eleanor, yes, trivial matters of trust. But poison her, absurd. I deal in artifacts, not murder." Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled, letting her words hang. The room was thick with tension now. Eleanor's shallow breathing, Holt's barely masked irritation. Clara's near panic, Beatrice's cool defiance. I knew Wolfe was reading every gesture, every pause, building his map of lies and half-truths. He hadn't accused anyone outright. He didn't need to. This was the wind-up, the slow tightening of the vice. He'd let them stew, watch them unravel under their own weight before striking. Very well, he said at last. You have spoken or evaded. I shall reflect. Remain in proximity to this office. None shall leave until I conclude. Archie, ensure refreshments are available in the front room. We reconvene shortly. I ushered them out, Saul trailing to keep an eye, and returned to Wolfe. Well, I asked, dropping into my chair. Got a front-runner yet? He grunted. Patience, Archie. The weave is complex, but the flaws emerge. We are close. Observe. They're now off guard. They may betray more. I smirked, knowing the real showdown was brewing. Wolfe had set the board. Now he was waiting for someone to flinch. And in this game, a flinch was as good as a confession. There's a peculiar kind of magic in watching Nero Wolfe work a room full of suspects, especially when they think they've got their masks bolted on tight. It's not about shouting or pointing fingers. It's about the slow, relentless grind of logic and pressure until someone's facade cracks like cheap glass. After the initial round of questioning in the brownstone office, with Eleanor Vaughan, Raymond Holt, Clara Dennis, and Beatrice Lang all sweating in their own ways under Wolfe's unblinking gaze, I knew we were at the tipping point. Wolfe had sent them to the front room for refreshments under Saul Panzer's watchful eye. But it wasn't a break, it was a trap. He was giving them just enough rope to hang themselves. And I was itching to see who'd tie the noose first. Back in the office, Wolfe sat behind his desk, a fresh beer in hand, looking as immovable as a boulder. I dropped into my chair, notebook still in hand, though I hadn't written much. Washing faces beats jotting notes any day. So, I said, keeping my tone casual, you've got them simmering out there. Who do you figure will boil over? First, Holt with his slick excuses, or Clara with her nerves. Wolfe took a measured sip, setting the glass down with precision. Patience, Archie. Behavior under duress is instructive, but incomplete. I have hypotheses, not certainties. The poison, the surveillance, the trespass in this house, they form a pattern. But the motive's root remains obscured. We shall provoke further, recall them in 10 minutes, observe interactions closely, particularly between Mrs. Vaughan and Mr. Holt. Their discord is a fissure. I nodded, checking my watch. 10 minutes to let them stew, whisper, maybe slip up in front of Saul, who'd report any murmurs. I used the time to grab a quick coffee from Fritz in the kitchen, noting he still looked jittery over the saffron jar incident. His domain hadn't been breached again, but the violation lingered like a bad smell. Back in the office, I relayed to Wolfe that Saul had texted nothing overt in the front room yet. Just tense glances, and Holt pacing like a caged tiger at the appointed time. I ushered the group back in. The air was thicker now, their faces tighter. Eleanor clutched her purse like a lifeline, her eyes darting between Holt and the door. Holt had dropped most of his smirk, his jaw set as he took his seat, Clara seemed smaller, if that was possible, her hands trembling in her lap. Beatrice Lang maintained her cool, that faint smile still playing on her lips. But I caught a flicker of calculation when she glanced at Wolfe. Saul resumed his post by the wall, a silent shadow. Wolfe didn't waste time on pleasantries. He never does. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a low rumble that pinned them in place. "Your reticence serves no one, least of all yourselves." A poison was administered to Mrs. Van deliberate, calculated. Surveillance haunts her residence. My own household has been trespassed. These are not disparate acts, but a sequence, driven by intent. I will not tolerate further evasion. Let us dissect. He turned to Eleanor first, his gaze unyielding. "Mrs. Van, your fear is patent, yet incomplete. You shield someone or something. The surveillance creditors you suggested. Name them or admit complicity in withholding." Eleanor's breath hitched, and for a moment I thought she'd clam up again. Then, under that stare, she cracked, just a hair. There was a man, after Victor died, a lender, rough type, named Carl Drayton. Victor owed him a fortune, hundreds of thousands. I've paid what I could, but he's threatened me. Said he'd watch until I settled. I didn't think it tied to the chocolates. I swear, Wolfe's expression didn't shift, but I saw the glint in his eye, a new piece slotted into place. He pivoted to Holt. "Mr. Holt, you claim to manage Mrs. Van's affairs for her benefit. Yet this Drayton, a creditor of note, eludes your narrative. Were you unaware or complicit in his pressure?" Holt's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "I knew of Drayton," he admitted, voice tight. "I've been negotiating with him, quietly, to keep him off Eleanor's back. He's a thug, sure, but I didn't arrange any tales. If he's watching her, it's his own doing. I'm trying to save her estate, not sink it. A half-truth, I'd bet my hat on it." Wolfe let it hang, turning to Clara. "Miss Dennis, your role as intermediary in the delivery remains pivotal. Mrs. Van's fear of you, evidenced by her distancing, suggests doubt. Did you know of this Drayton? Did you facilitate entry here or there?" Clara's eyes widened, panic spilling over. "No, I didn't know anyone named Drayton. I didn't let anyone in anywhere. I saw the package. I unpacked it. I didn't even eat any. I've been terrified. That's why I've stayed away. Please. I'm not hiding anything." Her voice broke, and I saw Eleanor flinch, as if Clara's distress confirmed a suspicion. Wolfe ignored the emotion, his focus sharpening as he addressed Beatrice. "Mrs. Lang, expertise in toxins is not mere trivia in this context. A slow poison, subtly dosed your domain. You dispute with Mrs. Van over trust. Did you seek to warn or wound?" Beatrice's smile finally faltered, just a fraction, but her tone stayed smooth. "Mr. Wolfe, I resent the implication. My collection is scholarly. I've no motive to harm Eleanor. Beyond petty disagreements, if a poison was used, it's not mine. Perhaps this Drayton sourced it elsewhere." Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled, letting silence reclaim the room. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, piecing motives with means, lies with half-truths. Then, unexpectedly, he shifted focus not to a person, but to the room. "The trespass here," he said, almost musing, the moved saffron jar. "A trivial act, yet pointed. Access to this house is limited. Miss Dennis, you've visited. Mrs. Van, you've entered. An agent of Drayton, perhaps, or one of you. Testing resolve. Speak." It was a gamble, a prod at their nerves, and it hit. Clara gasped, shaking her head furiously. Holt's eyes narrowed. Eleanor froze. But it was Beatrice who reacted strongest. Her smile vanished, and for a split second, I saw something like alarm before she masked it. Wolfe saw it too. He didn't pounce, just let the moment linger, then waved a hand. "Enough for now," he said. "Remain in the front room. I confer with my associate. Resolution nears." I escorted them out, Saul trailing, and returned to Wolfe. Beatrice blinked. I said, grinning. That jar mention caught her off guard. "You've got her on the ropes?" Wolfe grunted. "Possibly, Archie." Her reaction suggests knowledge, if not guilt. But motive remains. Mrs. Van's creditor complicates. We are close, very close. Prepare for one final confrontation. I shall lay the trap fully. I nodded, adrenaline humming. Wolfe had them all rattled, cracks widening. The confession trap was sprung. Now it was just a matter of who'd fall in first. I had my money on Beatrice, but with Wolfe, you never bet until the last move. And that move was coming, sharp and final. There's a moment in every case with Nero Wolfe when the fog lifts. Not because the world suddenly makes sense, but because Wolfe decides it's time to shine a spotlight on the mess and call it done. It's never a brawl or a chase. Those are my department. No, it's a quiet reckoning, delivered from behind his desk in the brownstone office with all the drama of a judge reading a verdict after the tension of the confession trap with Eleanor Van, Raymond Holt, Clara Dennis, and Beatrice Lang, teetering on the edge of their secrets. I knew we were at the finish line. Wolfe had rattled them, watched them squirm. And now he was ready to name the culprit behind the poisoned chocolates, the surveillance, and that damn moved saffron jar. Me? I was just glad to see the curtain fall. It was late afternoon, the light through the office blinds casting long shadows as I brought the group back from the front room for the final round. They looked worse for wear after an hour of stewing under Saul Panzer's silent watch. Eleanor's face was drawn, her purse still gripped like a lifeline. Holt's arrogance had eroded into a tight-lipped scowl. Clara seemed on the verge of tears, her hands trembling worse than ever. Beatrice Lang held her composure best. But that faint smile of hers was gone, replaced by a wary coolness. Saul resumed his post by the wall, and I took my seat at my desk, pen poised for show. Wolfe sat like a mountain, an orchid in a vase beside him, his gaze sweeping over them with methodical disdain. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a deep rumble that pinned them in their chairs. "This affair has been an irritant-poisoned confectionery delivered to Mrs. Van, surveillance at her residence, and an intrusion into my own household. I abhor such disruptions. The threads are now woven. One among you is responsible, not merely for a single act, but for the orchestration of fear. I shall name you. The room went still, not even a breath breaking the silence. Eleanor's eyes widened. Holt's jaw clenched. Clara whimpered softly, and Beatrice's fingers twitched just once. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, a rare movement, his bulk adding weight to his words. The poison in the chocolates a subtle compound. Non-lethal, but effective as a warning was no amateur's work. It required knowledge, access, and intent. Surveillance at Mrs. Vaughan's home suggested a broader design, intimidation tied to debts, specifically to a creditor named Carl Drayton. The trespass here, the moved saffron jar, was a petty but pointed act. Testing resolve or asserting reach, these are not disparate. They converge on motive, greed, revenge, control common drivers, but only one fits the pattern. He turned to Beatrice Lang, his gaze unblinking, and I saw her stiffen, though she kept her face neutral. Mrs. Lang, your expertise in toxins is not mere hobbyist trivia. Historical poisons, you claim. Yet your reaction to the mention of this household's intrusion betrayed recognition. You disputed with Mrs. Vaughan over trust alone. I deduce, unpaid or misused. Your means and opportunity align. You dosed the chocolates, a calculated warning to pressure repayment, leveraging her fear of scandal to ensure compliance. Beatrice's lips parted, a protest forming, but Wolfe raised a hand, silencing her. Denial is futile. Your composure is admirable, but your alarm at the saffron jar's mention exposed you. Access to this house came through observation, perhaps. During your acquaintance with Mrs. Vaughan's circle, noting routines, a courier, hired discreetly, delivered the chocolates. The surveillance was a secondary tactic. Also hired to amplify terror. You overreached with the trespass here, a misstep of arrogance to unsettle even me. It confirms you. The room held its breath. Beatrice's face hardened, her cool cracking at last. This is absurd, Mr. Wolfe, she said, voice tight but steady. You've no proof. I collect artifacts, not crimes. If Eleanor owed me, I'd pursue legal means, not poison. Wolfe grunted, unimpressed. Proof, madam, is in behavior as much as tangible evidence. Your knowledge is unique among this group. Mrs. Vaughan's fear of scandal, noted in her reticence, points to a personal debt one you wielded as leverage. The poison's sophistication excludes crude thugs like Drayton, whom Mr. Holt awkwardly shields. Miss Dennis lacks nerve and means. Mr. Holt's greed is evident, but his methods are fiscal, not chemical. You alone fit. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, staring at Beatrice with dawning horror. Holt shifted, his scowl deepening, but he stayed quiet smart, for once. Clara looked like she might faint, whispering, "I knew it wasn't me," under her breath. I stayed still, watching Beatrice, waiting for the final crack. She didn't collapse into sobs or confessions, not her style. Instead, she straightened, her voice cold. Hypothesis, Mr. Wolfe, not fact. Without evidence. This is slander. I'll not sit for it. She stood, as if to leave. But Saul stepped forward subtly, blocking the door without a word. Wolfe waved a hand, dismissive. Sit. Mrs. Lang, evidence will be procured. Archie, contact Inspector Kramer. Inform him of a confession imminent upon confrontation with laboratory analysis. Already in progress on the chocolate sample and a trace of hired surveillance, which Saul Panzer will corroborate. Mrs. Lang's financial records, when subpoenaed, will reveal payments to intermediaries. Her collection, I suspect, holds trace chemicals matching the toxin. She will speak, or the law will compel. That did it. Beatrice sat slowly, her face pale now, her hands clasping together in her lap. After a long, brittle silence, she spoke, voice low, if hypothetically. I acted. It was not to kill, a warning, as you said. Eleanor owed me a substantial sum, inherited from Victor, promised as repayment for a personal favor. She delayed, hid behind widow's grief. I sought to motivate. The saffron was a jest, a test of your reach. I underestimated you. Wolfe's lips twitched, a rare flicker of satisfaction. Underestimation is fatal. Madam, your jest violated my sanctum and unpardonable error. Mrs. Vaughan, your debt does not absolve silence. It exacerbated risk. Mr. Holt, your obfuscation regarding Drayton wasted time. Miss Dennis, your fear obscured little. He leaned back, the matter closed in his mind. Archie, summon Kramer now. Saul, ensure Mrs. Lang remains. The rest may depart under police advisement. This concludes. I got up, dialing Kramer, while Saul nodded. Stepping closer to Beatrice, who sat rigid, defeated, Eleanor, Holt, and Clara filed out, shell-shocked, murmuring thanks or excuses I didn't bother noting. Kramer arrived within the hour, grumbling as usual, but taking Beatrice into custody for questioning. Armed with Wolfe's summary and the lab results I'd rushed earlier, financial digs and her collection would seal it, I knew. Back in the office, Wolfe sipped beer, resuming his orchid book as if nothing had happened. Satisfactory, Archie, he muttered. A petty motive, but venomous execution. File the report. I smirked, typing it up later. The brownstone was quiet again, Fritz's kitchen sacred once more. The chocolates, the watcher, the jar all, tied to Beatrice's twisted leverage. Wolfe had unraveled it from his chair. As always, me? I was just glad to close the box on this one, figuratively and literally. Until the next mess, anyway. If there's one thing I've learned working for Nero Wolfe, it's that the end of a case doesn't come with a bang or a parade, it comes with a quiet, inevitable thud. Like a book snapping shut after the last page, Wolfe doesn't chase glory or theatrics. He dissects, concludes, and moves on, usually to his orchids or a beer, while I'm left to wrap up the loose ends and type the report. After Beatrice Lang's brittle admission, under Wolfe's unrelenting pressure, with the poisoned chocolates, the surveillance at Eleanor Vaughan's townhouse, and the trespass of Fritz's saffron jar all pointing to her twisted game of leverage, I knew we were at that final thud. The brownstone office was still heavy with the aftertaste of tension. But Wolfe had laid out the puzzle's pieces, and now it was time to box them up for good. It was pushing evening by the time Inspector Kramer hauled Beatrice away for formal questioning, She went without a fuss, her face a mask of cold resignation, knowing Wolfe's deductions backed by the lab analysis of the chocolate. And Saul Panzer's tale on her hired surveillance would dig up the dirt in her financials and poison collections soon enough. Eleanor Vaughn, Raymond Holt, and Clara Dennis had shuffled out earlier, each nursing their own mix of relief and guilt. Eleanor murmured a shaky thanks before leaving. Holt gave a curt nod with a glare that said he'd rather forget us, and Clara just looked like she might cry from sheer exhaustion. Saul stuck around briefly, confirming he'd follow up with Kramer on the surveillance angle, then tipped his hat and vanished into the night. The brownstone settled back into its rhythm. Fritz prepping dinner with a touch more calm now that the sanctity of his kitchen was avenged. In the office, Wolfe sat behind his desk, a fresh beer in hand, already flipping through a botanical journal as if the day's drama hadn't happened. I dropped into my chair, stretching my legs out, and watched him for a moment. "So," I said, unable to resist, "that's it. Beatrice rigs a poison scare for a debt, hires goons to spook Eleanor, and messes with Fritz's jar just to poke the bear meaning you. All wrapped up neat as a candy box. No last surprises," Wolfe grunted, not looking up. "Satisfactory, Archie." Motive was pedestrian financial coercion masked as personal slight, her intellect misapplied. Overreaching with the trespass here, a foolish taunt. "The matter is closed. Type the report. Include Kramer's involvement for completeness." I smirked, knowing that was as close to a pat on the back as I'd get. The case had unraveled logically, step by step, just as Wolfe prefers. The chocolates laced with a non-lethal toxin, confirmed by the lab as a rare alkaloid compound, were Beatrice's opening move. A warning to Eleanor to pay up on a substantial loan, tied to Victor Vaughn's murky past, a debt Eleanor had dodged. With excuses of grief, Beatrice, with her macabre collection and chemical know-how, had the means. And her public spat with Eleanor over trust gave the motive. The surveillance, hired muscle spotted by Saul, amplified the threat, making Eleanor feel cornered. The saffron jar incident, Beatrice's petty jab at Wolfe's sanctum, likely scoped during a prior visit to Eleanor's circle, and slipped in during Fritz's brief market run, was her mistake. A brag that tipped Wolfe to her involvement when her reaction betrayed recognition during questioning. It hung together tight. Holt's greed and shady dealings with creditor Carl Drayton were a smokescreen, a tangle Wolfe untied by pressing him and Eleanor separately. Holt was too blunt for poison, too focused on real estate flips. Clara's nerves were just that, nerves, from handling the delivery and fearing blame, nothing more. Her distance from Eleanor was self-preservation. Eleanor herself hid the debt out of shame, fearing scandal more than poison, which explained her reticence. Beatrice alone matched every clue, her cool cracking under Wolfe's calculated prods, until she admitted enough to seal her fate. I started typing the report. The clack of the keys a familiar coda to the chaos. Wolfe's resolution wasn't just about naming Beatrice, it was about restoring order. His order. The brownstone wasn't just a house. It was his fortress, and her trespass hit harder than the chocolates ever could. He dismantled her scheme from his chair, using logic as his weapon, observation as his shield, and me as his legs. Kramer would grumble about the late handoff, but he'd get his rest. Maybe even a conviction once Beatrice's records and collection were raided. She'd gambled on fear and lost to a man who doesn't rattle. Dinner came at 7 sharp. Fritz's roast duck. A quiet triumph after the kitchen scare and Wolfe ate with his usual focus, though I caught a rare flicker of contentment when Fritz confirmed the saffron was back in its rightful spot. I didn't push for more post-mortem. Wolfe despises rehashing once a case is shut, but as I finished my coffee, I couldn't help lingering on one thought. Beatrice's jest with the jar wasn't just arrogance. It was personal, a slap at Wolfe's control. And he returned it with interest by unmasking her in front of everyone. That was the real impact, not the poison, not the watchers, but the message that no one invades this house and walks away unscathed. Later, as I filed the report and Wolfe retreated to the plant rooms with Theodore, I glanced at the empty chairs where the suspects had sat hours before. The office was still again, the ghosts of their lies and fears dissipating like smoked. Eleanor would rebuild, dead or no. Holt would slink back to Wall Street schemes. Clara might even sleep without jumping at shadows. Beatrice, though she'd remember this, probably in a cell, as the day she underestimated Nero Wolfe. And me, I'd remember it as another notch on the belt. Another puzzle solved without leaving the block. Mostly, there'd be more messes, more intrusions, but for now, the brownstone stood firm, a fortress unbroken. I shut the file drawer, locked the office for the night, and headed upstairs with a smirk. Wolfe's style isn't flashy, no sirens, no fisticuffs, just a mind that cuts sharper than any knife Fritz wields. The last bite of evidence had been chewed, swallowed, and digested. Case closed. Until the next poor sap thought they could outsmart the big man in the chair. Good luck with that.